we go. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's standing by water. We shall not be moved.
Pete Seeger's long life as a folk singer, as an activist, and as a people's historian has had influence on millions. He grew up in a music-loving family and dedicated his entire life to sharing his love for music, the American people, and where both his passions came together, folk music. A popular radio artist in the 40s, he was one of the many thousands of Americans who were blacklisted during the McCarthy era due to his political beliefs. However, this censorship did not slow him down, and he continued to perform to smaller audiences, notably colleges. His music, which centered on themes of unity, solidarity, compassion, and activism, could be considered a major force kindling many of the new left-wing movements of the 1960s, as he reached many thousands of listeners, often young people, and helped to galvanize many movements for greater democracy and justice. Pete Seeger was born in Midtown Manhattan in 1919 to a violinist and a pioneer in the field of musicology, or the study of music. His youth was filled with song and melody and experiences with people around the country. As young as 18 months, he was brought to the South on a trip to share classical music to working people. What his family ended up discovering, however, was that the music every individual community shared with them was much more interesting. This kind of music was folk music, and at this time in American history it was only beginning to be recorded and shared. As he grew up, he would continue to travel the country, visiting local music festivals and learning as much as he could. At one of these festivals, he heard the 5-string banjo for the first time, and immediately fell in love with it, dedicating himself to mastering it.
It was about 25 years ago, I was a teenager at the time, that I first heard one of these long-neck banjos played. And it was the first time I realized that there was a lot of good music in my country that I didn't hear on the radio.
After his school days, Pete worked for Alan Lomax as he undertook the enormous job of searching race and hillbilly music recordings to pick music which best represented American folk music. This job was influential on Pete as he spent more time discovering the melodies and folkways from places east, west, north, and south. Additionally, he was encouraged during this time to himself participate in folk music, as he sang with the likes of important folk artists like Leadbelly, Josh White, and most notably, Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie is one of the most significant figures in the history of American folk music, being known as the Dust Bowl troubadour, writing songs like This Land Is Your Land, focusing on themes of socialism and anti-fascism, and influencing many folk artists after him. Pete began to travel with Woody after his days with Alan Lomax, riding freight trains and continuing his lifelong education on the diverse people of the United States, their stories, and their music. Pete's official music career began with the Almanac Singers, a group he co-founded with the purpose of being a traveling newspaper supporting unionization, racial inclusion, and religious tolerance, among other things. Eventually, the Almanac Singers would be reconstituted into the Weavers, a group which, due to the political atmosphere of the early 50s, had to be less overt in its messaging. The Weavers went on to become hugely successful, scoring major hits like 1950's Goodnight Irene at number 1. Eventually, however, the political beliefs and backgrounds of the members were discovered, and the Weavers were blacklisted from recording and performing at the height of their fame. Pete's solo career was not spared from the blacklisting either, as shortly after he was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee for his ties to the American Communist Party. Pete described the committee in an interview 10 years later.
They're a group, in my opinion, a group of American fascists. Their idea of America is America where everybody agrees with them.
During his testimony, Pete quote-unquote took the First Amendment rather than the Fifth.
The Fifth Amendment, in effect, is saying you have no right to ask me this question. But I wanted to say you have no right to ask any American citizen this question.
But during this time, Pete would go on to perform for hundreds of colleges, summer camps, and schools, and when the government and society at large ostracized him, he had arguably his biggest impact on American history. During this time, Pete was one of the few dissenting voices during a bleak, conformity-filled era. He traveled the country and sowed the seeds not only for a folk music revival, but for a political revival driven by young people seeking change and usurping authority. Most of the political and cultural movements we associate with the 60s, Pete was involved with. He was a champion of civil rights even back to the 40s, encouraging his fans and friends to participate in the struggle in the South. He was invited by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to march in Selma, helped to set up the career of the black musical activist group the Freedom Singers, and hugely helped to popularize the anthem of the entire movement, We Shall Overcome, as he modified the lyrics to the version we know today and taught it to everyone he could. He provided countless ballads for the anti-war movement and led 500,000 anti-war protesters in singing Give Peace a Chance in 1969. He performed the controversial anti-war song Waist Deep in the Big Muddy on CBS, which attacked President Johnson with 1/5 of all American households watching. Pete was also a dedicated environmentalist who created a non-profit organization to clean up the Hudson River and sailed a 106-foot-long sailboat which served as the organization's flagship. He would perform concerts on the boat and give tours of the Hudson, and his efforts helped to clean up the river which once was filled with toxic pollutants. His list of achievements in activism is too long to name, but he's also a feminist, a labor activist, a supporter of gay rights, an advocate for denuclearization, and an opponent of the Iraq War. The part he played in music history is enormous, as he was the driving force in the folk revival movement, one which would grow deeply popular among young people. Pete organized the Newport Folk Festival, a national stage for folk artists, and encouraged and mentored Bob Dylan, who would become one of the most famous and innovative folk artists of all time. More importantly, perhaps, he brought the concept of protest and music being intertwined together to the popular consciousness. During the 60s, popular music and protest became ever closer, with hidden and upfront political messages. Pete heavily led to this development, and because of this, and because of every one of his performances, he was a cultural symbol and icon who led to so much change in American society. Even after many of the 60s movements had declined, he continued to strive for change, and continued to perform almost non-stop, still having major influence on many. He received the Kennedy Center's Honors Award in 1994, honored by the same government which 50 years earlier had blacklisted him, and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1996. Even in the final years of his life, he never stopped pursuing justice, never stopped supporting others. He participated in an impromptu Occupy Wall Street march in 2011, marching 30 blocks at age 92. One of his very last public performances was at Farm Aid 2013, a year before he would pass away.
Friends, at age 94, I don't have much voice left.
Pete would pass away in 2014 at 94 after living a long and full life. Even with no voice left and a failing memory, Pete could inspire. Throughout his long life and 8-decade career, he was driven never by the applause of his audience, but by the unity of diverse people joining in song with one collective voice. Pete Seeger, with nothing more than his voice and his banjo, would touch millions directly and indirectly. He was one of the most important musicians and activists in American history, inspiring millions, bringing direct change, and leaving a legacy that will live on through the ages.